to the independent podcasters and the future that they're laying out for us is not healthy. It's not something I'm super excited about. It's going to cost you something to stand up against that. And it might cost you 30% of your current listeners, but there's still a way to succeed and grow your show outside of that. It might require a little bit more work. It might take a little bit more time, but you can do it. But anything of value, we all know this, right? Anything of value is going to cost something. And so that's the question that I think that we should all struggle with as independent podcasters is, am I willing to pay the price to slow down what Spotify is trying to do in the podcasting space? And it might be in vain because, just Buzzsprout holding our own podcast out of Spotify, it's not going to change anything. If everybody on Buzzsprout held their shows out, that might make a difference. I mean, Joe Rogan held his content out of Spotify long enough until they were able to fill the truck full of money and drive it over to his house. And so he made a difference, but in the end he caved. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't if they delivered that same truck of money to my house. I was a very
Buzzcast will move to Spotify for 100 million plus.
Yeah. I get it. But it's something that we should think about because if we do love podcasting, we do have our opportunity to cast our vote. Just like when you're voting for someone in political office, you might not think your vote counts, but we know in the grand scheme of things, it does count. We have to get a movement behind it, right? We've got to get enough people who believe the same things that we do.
Yep. So I want to wrap up with a sort of 5 Minute Monday episode, hearkening back to our now archived show, and just give some tips. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, yeah, I don't want to, be a part of supporting what Spotify is building. How do I transition my audience off of Spotify? Well, the first thing you shouldn't do is just take your podcast off of Spotify. So what you should do is spend the next few weeks, next couple of months saying, hey guys, we're no longer going to be on Spotify in the near future. If you listen on an Android app, here are some other apps you can download that are actually better for podcast listening. And the links actually work in the show notes and those kind of things. And teach your audience and show them how to transition off of Spotify before you pull the plug on it. And then the other thing to keep in mind is once you're not on Spotify, it's not like your podcast stops growing because you're still everywhere else. Spotify right now is still only between 15 and 30% of podcast listening. So it's not like you're giving up hundreds of millions of listeners. It's just a small fraction right now. And so if this is something you're thinking about, the sooner you pull the trigger, the better. Because you'll be able to make that shift and then focus your efforts on growing on these other platforms that aren't doing the things that Spotify is doing. So that's the advice I would give if someone is thinking about shifting a considerable number of listeners off of Spotify, but they don't want to lose the audience that they've worked so hard to build. So let's talk about transcripts. This has been a project we've been working on for quite some time, actually, in the background. We rolled out a transcripts integration with Temi. When was that? Like a year ago? Over a year ago?
Oh, yeah. Way over a year ago. Yeah.
Yeah. We built transcripts into Buzzsprout. The reason transcripts are helpful is you can take your audio content that you worked so hard to make and turn it into a blog post or use it for search engine optimization and that kind of stuff. But Temi recently raised their prices, so it became less ideal to use that service. So then we rolled out our own, and we had our own transcripts built up, and we were offering it as a free feature for people to test out. But it wasn't as accurate as some of the other machine transcribe services. So, Kevin, why don't you catch us up on what the latest iteration of Buzzsprout transcripts is and why we think in the long run this is going to be the best solution for podcasters.
Right. So Travis kind of laid out the nutshell version of what we've been struggling with for the past year and a half or so. And it's snapped into focus in the past 6 months as soon as Temi raised their prices significantly. It used to be 10 cents a minute, now they're 25 cents a minute. So that's not a little price hike. That's a pretty massive price hike. It's like, what?
250%?
Yeah, 250%, but just crazy, you know? And so we were losing our minds, tried to work with them for a long time about, you can't just raise your prices that much overnight. They disagreed. And so we decided to shift our focus and figure out how we could make Buzzsprout more flexible to work with different transcription service providers, because there's a lot of them. And Temi is a good one, but the way that they thank their customers for I don't want to rip on them too much, but that's not a nice way to treat your customers, is that the more and more customers that were coming to them and finding them, and then they raise their prices like that. So there's the good news is that there's other great options out there. And Otter was one that really stood out to us. Their machine learning technology, and I guess they actually technically they call it just speech to text technology, was really good. It was on par or better in most cases of most of our tests than Temi. Their editor was a nicer editing experience. But again, the question becomes, are we going to create an integration that locks a bunch of Buzzsprout customers into one solution? And so we wanted to try to figure out a way, how can we work with the best of breed transcription services, because things are changing so fast. There's better ones coming out all the time. And if somebody starts, has a breakthrough in technology that leaps ahead of Temi or Otter or whoever else we integrate with, we want our customers to be able to switch to that pretty quickly as well. And we had conversations with a couple of these companies. They're all fantastic people and trying to do the best work. But they're doing a lot of R&D. And so the stuff's expensive, and I get all that. Anyway, where we landed was the idea that you could use whatever service that you want. So the Temi integration is still built in. And then we also built in the ability to import Otter files. So if you decide Otter's the best solution for you right now, we also have a discount code that they offered Buzzsprout users. When you log into your Buzzsprout account, click on resources, you'll see it on the right sidebar. If you want to sign up for Otter for a year, you get 20% off. And then you can use their transcription service for your audio. And then when you're done, export a text file, and you upload that to Buzzsprout. We'll format it perfectly. It'll look wonderful in your Buzzsprout account. You can then copy and paste that into your blog or anywhere else. And then what building this system has let us do is that anybody else who comes out, who's going to be the next breakout star in the transcription world? I don't know. It might be Transcriptio. Let's say Transcriptio is whoever they are. They start killing it. No, it's not a real company. So don't try to Google that. But a fictional company, Transcriptio, launches next month, and they have great files. Well, we can just adapt an importer so that you can import their files as well. And so that's the solution that we landed on for Buzzsprout, was that we want it to be super flexible. We believe in transcripts. We believe they're really helpful for your podcast. And we believe that they're important to provide from an accessibility issue first and foremost. And then as a side benefit of making sure your podcast is accessible, you might also see some better SEO benefits as well. But again, we would encourage you to use transcripts for the accessibility. That's first and foremost. So whether you get an SEO bump or not, we still think it's important. Now, that said, we understand that a lot of people podcast as a hobby or as a, something they just do on the side, and finances are tight, and transcripts do cost money. And so, don't feel bad if you can't pay for them. And so what we've also added is the ability to manually create your own transcript. And then you can just copy and paste it in. So you can just open up a word processor and type out whatever you want. Or if you have a friend or somebody on Fiverr or somebody, if you can find a way just to get your transcripts written out, you can now just copy and paste them into Buzzsprout, and we'll display them as transcripts as well. So those are all the reasons that we love it. We think that transcripts are a responsible way to present audio content, put a transcript behind it, because people who are hearing disabled, that's a bummer, right? They want to consume your content, you're creating good content, but because they have a disability, they can't consume it. Transcripts are the solution to that. And so we think they're really important. We really do believe in them. And we're trying to provide you all the tools so that you have all the options in the world to be able to get a transcript attached to your podcast.
All right, so there's been a lot of news. This kind of gotten overshadowed a little bit by the Joe Rogan stuff, but Podcast Addict has, for the third time in the last 6 months, been kicked out of the Google Play Store for linking to podcasts. And, there's been a ton of people talking about this. So to give a little bit of context of what happened, all the podcast apps generally link out to the websites for the podcast they list. They don't host these shows. They're just listing them so that people can find them. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, Google really cranked up their algorithms to check for content that was talking about fake cures or was just preying on people or were scammy, which apparently have just been a ton. And in doing that, they have started catching apps and saying, hey, you were linking to this scammy website, because some podcasts are scammy. And so they kicked a bunch of podcasts out. But this is concerning because Podcast Addict is the number one rated and most downloaded podcast player on all of Android. Well, coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, who knows? At the same time, Google has been doing so much more with their own player. The Google Podcast Player has been gaining a ton of listeners, has been doing really well. It's been well received. They've launched Google Podcast Manager. They've been doing quite a bit. And so while it may not be nefarious, at the same time that Google is pushing more into the space, Podcast Addict has found themselves kicked out of the Google Play Store multiple times for a week plus. So that's laying a little bit of the groundwork. What have you guys been reading about this? What have you been thinking?
So I think the thing that was alarming to me when I saw this news was, one, it doesn't seem like Google is playing fair, especially when you consider that they didn't kick their own app out of the Play Store for hosting the same podcast that got Podcast Addict kicked out. But the other thing that makes me think about is, what is a podcast app? When you submit your podcast to an app and they accept it, if you do anything illegal, if you play Ariana Grande songs without permission, like, the lawyers don't go after the podcast app. They go after the podcaster because they're the ones that originated the content. And so treating apps like Podcast Addict not just as a place that you can go and listen to other people's content, but as the host of the content itself, I mean, that has been a conversation with social media platforms like Facebook. Like, should they be held accountable for videos and stuff that's posted to their platform or not? How do we kind of manage this whole thing with who's responsible for what? So that's the part of the conversation that's interesting to me, is these larger players, are they going to start making rules for third-party apps that are delivering an exceptional product and listening experience that are different than their own rules, for their own advantage? So that was kind of my first reaction, was I really hope this isn't what's happening and a precursor to what's going to happen down the road.
Yeah, you can understand why they may have gotten kicked out of the store for linking to these the first time. This is anecdotal, but we spend money on Google through Google Ads. And I've seen in the last 3 months way more ad rejections in a week than I've had in the entire 5 years we've been on Google Ads. And the reason that's happened is because they are getting so much garbage thrown at them, they had to start filtering it. So this is me trying to spend money with Google, and they're still flagging that stuff going. I mean, they would flag a video like this and say, is this objectionable material? Stuff that is like not even close has gotten flagged for us. So I know that they are catching things that they don't want to catch. Like, they want us to be able to spend money, and they have flagged that out of an abundance of caution. So I get that. Like what Travis is saying, the thing that really kind of stings about it is this has not happened once or twice. This has happened 3 times. It takes forever for it to get resolved for Podcast Addict. It's not like this is some guy, working out of his basement and he has like 2 downloads. This is a massive app at the same time that the Google branded version has not been hit with the same restrictions, or at least, I mean, maybe that they're smart enough that they built the app in a way that it wouldn't get flagged. But unfortunately, Podcast Addict does not seem to be playing on an equal playing field, because they are not able to look over and, they're not able to tap a engineer on the shoulder and say, hey man, what do we do to not get flagged by this new algorithm that's running around, banning apps?
Yeah. Do you guys know when they ban it from the store? It doesn't like pull it off of everybody's phone who had already downloaded it, right?
No, it doesn't.
It just prevents new downloads.
Yeah, it only stops the new downloads. But Podcast Addict, when writing about it online, they've said like this takes a week to get back. And a week in the podcast industry right now, when you're the number one app and Google has a app that is quickly catching up to you, is devastating. That's not like, oh, that was a little bit of an inconvenience. Like, if we actually got, Buzzsprout actually has built other apps in the past. If one of those apps had gotten kicked off for a week, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. It'd been very frustrating. But this is like the critical